This show is produced by the Hartman Media Company. For more information and links to all our great podcasts, visit hartmanmedia.com.
Welcome to The Commercial Investing Show, where we analyze, explain, and exploit the opportunities presented in today's commercial property marketplace. If you're interested in apartments, mobile home parks, self-storage facilities, and other income property, you've come to the right place. We'll explore what's hot and what's not in markets nationwide in the relentless pursuit of return on investment. Here's your host, Jason Hartman.
It's my pleasure to welcome Michael Finch. He is a principal at SVN and SFRhub Advisors. Michael, welcome. How are you?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
Good.
How are you?
Good to have you, and you're coming from Phoenix, is that correct?
We are headquartered in Phoenix, yes.
Good stuff. So build to rent, this is a somewhat new, it's always been happening throughout history, I guess, but it's really catching on, the BFR model, where people are basically developing homes, single-family homes many times, or residential communities of townhomes for rental. Not an apartment building, a little different. Tell us about the model and why it's attractive.
Well, it's attractive for many reasons. One, we've got a shortage of supply across the country of rental product, whether it's, more affordable rental product or just rental product in general. You've got 40% of the country today that rents. Of that 40%, roughly, I think it's like 37% prefer to rent single-family detached homes. So, when you've got, nearly 18 plus minus million people renting detached single-family homes, and the population is growing more and more with both millennials, Gen Xers, and baby boomers all preferring to rent or choosing to rent, and or even if they're not choosing to rent, they can't afford to buy. 54% of the country can't buy. So it's all spurring the growth of the build-for-rent model.
It's not just the fact that they are in a position where they either want to or need to rent. It's because they want to, but they don't want to live in an apartment complex, right?
Oh, exactly. You can't, most of the apartments that are being built, are all, 70+% one bedrooms and efficiency units, and then the balance being two bedrooms. So, there's very few outside of, the older apartment buildings that were built in the 80s that even have three bedrooms anymore. So, if you're a young millennial, if you're boyfriend, girlfriend, you got a dog, maybe you're having your first kid or getting married, you typically want to live in a three-bedroom home. If you're a married couple with children, you have to have at least a three or a four-bedroom home, and maybe you need an extra room for an office, or you're a baby boomer downsizing from, a 3,000 or 4,000 square foot home, and all the kids are gone, and you still wouldn't want to move into a two-bedroom apartment. You want to have a yard and a backyard and the privacy of single-family living. So it just makes a lot of sense for a lot of people.
What kind of deals do you think are ideal in the BFR, the build-for-rent model? What's the style of home? What's the price of the home? What metro area? How much rent do you command for it? Sort of the stereotypical deal, if you will.
I would say the stereotypical deals are really happening in the sunshine smile of the country, though we are starting to see some build-for-rent happening in the Midwest as well, but predominantly in the sunshine smile of the country.
And so what that really means, just so not everybody knows what that means, if you looked at the map of the U.S. and you put a smile, a smiling mouth across it, that's the kind of the shape that he's talking about. Correct.
So, you're really anywhere from California all the way to Virginia, and kind of that smile that encompasses, Arizona through Texas into Florida, Georgia, up to the Carolinas. That kind of covers the smile of the country. And by and large, the ideal build-for-rent home is very similar to a typical entry-level first-time buyer home. So very likely under $250,000. They certainly can be more than $250,000 if they're located in the right submarket and the rents make sense, and you have an affluent population that's also choosing to rent, which we're seeing in large numbers. One of the biggest rent growth populations today is an affluent market that makes over $100,000 a year. So we see it all from those that are willing to pay $1,350 to $1,700-$1,800 a month for a nice single family home, all the way up to those that are willing to pay $2,500 to $3,000 that could easily afford to buy a home, but they just choose to rent. It's a unique product.
So if they're paying $1,300 to $1,700 a month, how much are you paying to acquire that house?
Well, again, it's all sub-market specific, but if you were looking, in that, I would say $1,500 to $1,700 a month range, you're going to be in the low twos to maybe mid twos.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. I got to tell you, that rent to value ratio is not super exciting for the investor, is it? You got some appreciation built in there.
Well, you got to keep in mind that these run much more efficiently than a typical apartment. When you have single family detached homes, the resident is paying the water, the sewer, the trash, the electric, the cable, the Wi-Fi. Your operating expenses are significantly reduced.
Yeah. Okay.
A typical apartment building is running around, 40% of gross, where a typical build for rent, really depending on the location, i.e. taxes and insurance, can be anywhere from, 27% operating expenses up to usually 35 on the higher end.
Mm-hmm. Well, and the other thing you didn't mention is that the turnover is lower, right?
Turnover is drastically lower.
Yeah.
The residents that rent in a single family build for rent subdivision, on average are saying, much closer to 4 to 5 years. There's almost a pride of ownership that happens when you move into a new home to rent. And you're typically moving there, because of nearby jobs and the school districts. So it's not economical to pack up in a year or two, a 3-4 bedroom home and then try to find another home within the same zip code or school district or near the job. So the tenure is drastically longer than the typical apartment dweller, which is about, on average, 14 months.
Good. Okay. What else do you want people to know about this? And, just the whole build for rent thing. You do have to pay a bit of a premium. You used to be able to get the 1% rule, right? It's just the market has just appreciated significantly. So you just can't command those types of rent to value ratios anymore, which, makes a lot of investors wish for the good old days. But, in a few years, we'll be thinking this is the good old days. So
Yeah, maybe. But you certainly have to be a bit more sophisticated than investors were in what you call the good old days, which is when, things were, 50 cents on the dollar.
Yeah.
That's not where we're at today.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a lot of savings both for the builder and for the buyer. So let's take this as an example and say a builder was going to build 100 single-family homes for $250,000. That's what he would be selling to the retail consumer, if he was going to sell one by one to homeowner.
Mm-hmm.
That may take that builder 3.5 years, to get out of that community, to sell, from start to finish, to start selling the first home, to get out and sell the last home.
Mm-hmm.
In a build for rent, where we're bringing investors to the table much sooner into the development, where the builder can deliver, say 10 homes a month to a buyer. Well, now that builder, instead of selling the homes for 250, maybe they're selling them for 235,
mm-hmm.
but they're out of that community in, say, 10 or 11 months. So that's a significant reduction in their builder warranty expense, their land carry costs. They may be able to bring down the finishes, and oftentimes they do,
mm-hmm.
to where they're not building to a for sale product, but, a nice, durable, almost like a Class A apartment building build, putting in finishes for rent instead.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of cost savings that they can bring down and actually make more money and maybe do 2 projects in the same amount of time as doing one. But those cost savings also get passed on to the buyer. So if the buyer is buying, what would have been a $250,000 home, and they're getting it for $235,000, for example, well, they're starting off with equity in the home, and they're probably, depending on the location, which it's all a factor of rents, but, a $235,000 home, should be renting at $1,750, $1,800, and that's not a bad return. And keep in mind, you've got no CapEx, you've got very little turnover, very long-term tenants, very low operating expenses compared to, either new construction apartments and certainly older vintage apartments. The stabilized cap rate would typically be probably a 6.5%, maybe better, but you can't buy a C-class apartment building in today's market at a 6.5 cap rate. in most submarkets. So you've got new construction with very little to no maintenance, no capex, very affluent, or even if not affluent, but higher quality tenants.
I agree. You don't have to convince me.
So,
I agree.
Yeah.
Single family is just a better market. Yeah.
And in the long term, you've got greater liquidity and greater appreciation, most likely.
Yeah.
So if the housing market appreciates, now you've got 100 homes that, if you wanted, you could sell one by one or in smaller chunks to smaller investors, or
you can sell them. You can sell them to an emotional buyer who wants a home rather than an investor. So it's a whole different animal. Do you have any special financing for people who want to buy portfolios like this? Are you working with, some of the typical companies out there, or just talk to us about the financing side? Someone wants to buy 10 properties at a time, or they want to buy 100 properties at a time. How do they do the financing?
Well, we work very closely with Walker Dunlop. We've been working with some of them on the build for rent purposely, in that they're putting together bridge loans. And there are other groups that do this too. Corvest, who we work with, Lima Capital, 5 Arts. There's a lot of groups that
we've worked with Lima.
Finance the SFR. Okay. That play in the SFR space. But in particular, we've been developing, and Walker Dunlop's developed a program for developers and builders to do construction and vertical financing. And then for the buyer, bringing in bridge loan financing, if the buyer is going to buy 100 homes in tranches, so say 10 homes a month, so then they can work to, lease those homes up and close, on a bridge loan per tranche. And then once the community is finished, you can roll it into permanent debt. That's a lot more attractive. The same type of debt structure you can get on an apartment building.
Yeah, really interesting. So it's one blanket loan for all of the single-family homes, right?
It would be multiple bridge loans, and then you roll it into permanent debt.
Yeah, got it. Good stuff. Okay, what else do you want people to know?
I would like people to know that this is really just in its infancy. This is a brand new commercial asset class. I honestly think it's going to be one of the biggest asset classes moving forward. People have been doing build for rent, kind of small local builders and markets across the country for a long time, but not to the scale that it's approaching now, where buyers, especially large, institutional type buyers, the multinational, asset type buyers and family office, private equity groups. I mean, they're looking at this and they want to see fully amenitized communities because the demand is there. But it works equally as well if you've got a 20 lot subdivision to build for rent. So, it can be small subdivisions, medium, large. Typically we see once you're over 120 units in build for rent, you're going to want some amenities, probably a clubhouse and a pool, fairly similar to apartment buildings. But if you're under that number, you probably don't need those amenities. And then that helps, just drive your operating costs down even further.
Yeah, really interesting. Something you were talking about earlier was how the builders can exit their developments a lot faster. And this really has to be just turning the home building industry on its head. They are not used to this type of thing at all. Now they're sort of needing to act, if they want to take advantage of this opportunity, more like an apartment developer. Versus, and before they used to stage, well, they still do, obviously, but, stage things out in phases and build a tract of homes rather slowly, frankly, over about maybe 3-4 years. But now if you've got investors who can just gobble them up as they come online, but in the past, builders were very reluctant to have a bunch of investors in their communities. They don't want to see a bunch of for rent signs. They think it'd scare off the homeowners. So is it kind of an all or nothing proposition where you got to go to the builder and say, look, we're going to sell everything to an investor? Or is it, we'll sell some of your units to investors, and then they're thinking, well, we don't want too many investors in here. How does that dynamic play out?
It is not an all or nothing anymore. And so I'll first address, I think the opportunity and the reason that a lot of the publics and regional builders are looking and now doing build for rent. One, because it'll be the first time in history, if there is a market slowdown or correction, or I know some people are hoping for a big recession, just to buy cheaply again. But if there is, it'll be the first time that builders can continue building. They don't have to stop production. If people are losing homes, they're going to want to rent homes. So a builder can just keep building, and investors can buy the homes and rent them. that's unique in and of itself, because the demand is there today, and if there's a market correction, there's just going to be greater demand because people will have lost their homes. And it's already happening today and has been for quite some time, a number of years, where builders have been selling portions of the community, maybe the last 10% or the first 10% or just some scattered homes, to investors in those communities already. The stigma of a renter just isn't what it used to be, and it's becoming less and less what it used to be, just given the huge number of Americans that are choosing to rent today.
Oh, yeah, no, I don't deny that. That's definitely a new trend, and it's I think it's a good one. I think that's actually healthy.
I think it's a great one.
I'm not in favor of this high home ownership rate. I think that's a bogus idea.
Well, I don't think the government is either, because they seem to be passing more legislation that is less tax favorable to homeowners.
Well, if you're in one of the high salt states, yes, you're right. Why people are leaving California and New York. Yeah.
The Tax Cut and Jobs Act increased the standard deduction for many people, eliminating the deduction they can take on home ownership. So
yeah, you mean from the $1 million to $750,000, right? That's... Yeah, definitely true. So it's interesting. No, I think that's a healthy trend. But what I'm saying is from the developer's perspective, from the home builder's perspective, that's what I was really referring to. So interesting stuff. Wrap it up with a thought for us and give out your website.
Well, I just want to thank you for your time. To any of the capital groups and apartment investors out there that haven't started looking at build-for-rent space, I encourage you to call us here at SFRhub Advisors, or take a look at our technology platform, which is a data evaluation and digital transaction site at SFRhub.com. We would love to talk. We spend a lot of time just consulting and educating and kind of spreading the gospel, so to speak, of build for rent. We are big believers and think it's going to be the biggest asset class in commercial real estate moving forward. I think we have a very, very long runway for the build for rent developments.
Good stuff. Michael, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for listening. Please be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any episodes. Be sure to check out the show's specific website and our general website, hartmanmedia.com, for appropriate disclaimers and terms of service. Remember that guest opinions are their own, and if you require specific legal or tax advice or advice in any other specialized area, please consult an appropriate professional. And we also very much appreciate you reviewing the show. Please go to iTunes or Stitcher Radio or whatever platform you're using and write a review for the show. We would very much appreciate that. And be sure to make it official and subscribe so you do not miss any episodes. We look forward to seeing you on the next episode.